at this point, I began to start reading about Islam. I started reading the Quran. I began with Surah Maryam. And I have to tell you, Paul, it was very revelatory for me to be reading these words about Mary and, of course, Jesus, Isa. And it was a revelation.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Sebelum menjadi seorang mu'alaf, jalan berliku harus ditempuh oleh Russell Oxton, yang merupakan seorang pendeta gereja Anglikan Inggris, yang mengabdi sebagai kapelan di beberapa rumah sakit. Bagaimanakah perjalanannya dari seorang pendeta Anglikan hingga menemukan Islam dan akhirnya menjadi seorang mu'alaf?
Hello everyone and welcome to Blogging Theology. Today I am delighted to talk to Yusuf Oxton. You are most welcome, sir. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam. It's an honor to be here, Paul, so thank you for having me. Thank you.
Yusuf Oxton, also known as Russell Oxton, was an ordained Anglican priest, that's in the Church of England, for 12 years. After 5 years in parish ministry, he spent 7 years of ministry in healthcare, working as a hospital chaplain in East London and as a hospice chaplain in Kent. In 2010, he made the life-changing decision to embrace Islam and become a Muslim. So, Yusuf, could you share something of your spiritual journey as a priest and how you came to be interested in Islam?
Sure. Thank you, Paul. Bismillah. My own journey, I think, was quite a gradual journey. I would say consciously, it took about two to 3 years before I finally made the decision to embrace Islam and declare the Shahada. As you mentioned, I was ordained in 98 as a deacon, 99 as a priest. After 5 years of parish ministry, I'd always been attracted to healthcare chaplaincy during my training. So I was lucky enough to be appointed chaplain at a very busy East London hospital where there was a very high Muslim population. It was the first time in my life that I was living alongside Muslims. My office was right next door to the multi-faith prayer room. So on a daily basis, I would see Muslims very quietly come to pray, very quietly, in a very dignified manner. I found the Salah a very dignified, simple act of worship. And without any inkling that this was going to impact me at all, I was impressed. I was impressed by so many Muslims that I met over that 5-year period. So that really was my first daily exposure to Islam through the people I met. No real theological discovery or reading was going on at that point. What I would say that during my training, I was lucky enough to be chosen to travel to India on a student exchange. So a training priest from India came to Birmingham, and I was chosen to travel to South India to study for about 4 months in a seminary. And it was an amazing occasion. And I remember a very well-esteemed, highly respected priest Reverend Canon Andrew Wingate. I'm not sure if he is still alive, a wonderful man. And he had spent many years in India exploring interfaith dialogue. And he took me on a visit to a village in a very rural part of India. And he took me to the local mosque, and we sat down and we watched the Muslims of the village come together and to pray. And again, that had quite an impact for me, to watch these villagers come together and to pray the Asr prayer together. And Andrew and I simply watched. And again, I absorbed that experience, and it was placed somewhere in my heart. So it was these moments, I think, that had an impact. But bizarrely and ironically, it's when I left London and I moved to East Kent, which at the time had a tiny, tiny Muslim population. It was here working in the hospice. And it was at this point I began to start reading about Islam. I started reading the Quran, and I began with Surah Maryam. And I have to tell you, Paul, it was very revelatory for me to be reading these words about Mary and of course Jesus, Isa. And it was a revelation. And so on my days off, I would travel to London. I would go to Al Taqwa Books on Baker Street. And also, having known East London, I would travel to Zamzam Books on Queen Street. And so there I was, traveling incognito to London. And I began to slowly build up an Islamic library back home. And so I began to feel that my heart was beginning to shift. And I really do feel primarily it's been a journey of the heart. And what was an interest was becoming a very intense dialogue with Islam. And I began to see that this was taking me deeper into an inner conflict with myself. And you know, again, Allah works in mysterious ways. I returned to East London. I was appointed a chaplain at another very large East London hospital with, again, a very, very large Muslim population. And it was here really that the momentum began to really take hold. Something very profound was happening spiritually for me. And I was beginning to ask questions. But at that point, I had not really envisioned that end point, if you like, of becoming a Muslim. But I did begin to reach out to a small number of people. And I would like to mention a dear brother who sadly suddenly passed away about 5 or 6 years ago. And he was Idris Tawfiq. Now, Idris Tawfiq was a former Roman Catholic priest from England. He left the priesthood and became a teacher for a short time, and then himself converted to Islam. And I discovered him on the internet. And I remember sitting in my office at the hospital, sending him an email, feeling I was taking a little bit of a risk, sending this to him. And I sent it, and many days went by, and then suddenly I got the most beautiful, long, pastoral response from Idris Tawfiq. And it was very caring, very wise, and it helped me a great deal. And can you believe it, Paul? 3 years later, subhanallah, this is a crazy story. I was with my wife in Cairo. We were walking into a shopping mall in central Cairo, and out walks Idris Tawfiq.
Wow.
He had moved to Egypt,
Mm.
and by chance, by Allah, we walked into him, and I said, I'm Russell. You may not remember me. You sent me the most beautiful response to my email, and here I am. I'm now a Muslim 3 years later. I'm living in Cairo, and we had the most wonderful conversation on the streets of Cairo. I was forever grateful for him. And then you and I met through London Central Mosque.
We did.
And I used to go to, I think it was called a Saturday Circle, I think. One of those Saturdays, by chance, it had not been announced. I was in the auditorium, and suddenly there was a lot of noise, a lot of discussion. Somebody had entered the room, and in walks Yusuf Islam. So I met Yusuf Islam at the end of one of the talks. Complete surprise. There was a huge crowd around him, and I waited very patiently for him, and he had noticed me. And so again, I approached him, and again, he was a man of great humility.
Yes.
I found him to be a very humble man, mashallah. And he also gave me some advice, because at that time, Paul, I felt there were one or two Muslims who were putting great pressure on me to convert in that moment, and I did not feel ready. And Yusuf Islam gave me great advice. Ultimately, this is between you and Allah. Take your time, listen to the whisperings of your heart, follow your heart, and you will know when you're ready. And it just steadied me at that point.
Good advice. Yeah.
Yes. Because I think what I can't underestimate, Paul, is when I took my ordination vows in 1999, I took them extremely serious. I anticipated a lifelong service to the church as a priest. Being a priest was everything to me. I became a practicing Christian when I was in my late teens, and I became very active within the Anglican Church. And so when I did begin to contemplate converting to Islam, I would say there was a 6-month period where I felt that I was on the verge of a complete breakdown.
Gosh.
I was living this public life as the priest. I was performing the priestly duties and pastoral duties of a chaplain. I was talking and being alongside many Muslims on a daily basis. And then I would go home and I would continue my reading. In the hospital, there was a very small prayer room at the top of one of the buildings, very high, with amazing scenes of East London. And I would walk into the prayer room and quietly read from the Quran in English whilst I was still a priest. And so I recognized that something very profound was happening, and I was beginning to feel like I was living a double life. And late one night, I was the on-call chaplain in the hospital, and for some reason, the Muslim chaplain was unavailable. So the senior ward sister of A&E, accident and emergency, called me and said there was a young Muslim woman. Her young child had been rushed into A&E, who was critically ill due to an unforeseen accident. Could you come and offer pastoral support? So I went quite late in the night into the hospital. The ward sister directed me to the waiting room, which was right next door to the resuscitation room, and I met this young woman with extraordinary nur on her face, incredible light on her face. And she was there in a moment of profound crisis for her. And yet she was still able to smile with gratitude at my presence. And we began to exchange conversation as we waited. And she asked me if she could have a prayer mat, a sajada. So I then rushed up to the prayer room, rushed back down, and I handed her the sajada. And she was deeply grateful. And then, completely naturally, completely spontaneously, she moved the furniture aside. She took the coffee table aside. She laid out the prayer mat and she prayed. And I stood in the corner silently as she prayed. It was an incredibly moving moment. She was a young Algerian woman. And she prayed and she was most grateful. And then we waited for her husband to arrive. He was working. I think he had 2 or 3 jobs in order to keep his family. And so he arrived about an hour later. And again, he had great poise. And he was able to share with me his belief as a Muslim at this critical moment for them and their family. What believing in Islam means, what believing in Allah means. And he talked about surrender. He talked about tawakkul, trust in Allah. And so we sat and we waited, and then eventually the medical team said they had stabilized their child. And so I guided them, I walked them into the resuscitation room where they could see their child, and the mother had the most incredible face of love that a mother can have for her child. And they stabilized their child, and it felt right. After about 2 or 3 hours, it was the right time for me to leave. And as I left, she handed me back the sajada. And I said, no, I said, I would like you to have this sajada, and inshallah, may this sajada be used by yourself and in years to come by your child. And eventually, I think that night, they were transferred to a more specialist hospital. I think it was the Royal London or Great Ormond Street. I phoned up some days later, but of course, because of the code of confidentiality, all I knew was that the child had been stabilized and was out of danger. But you know, Paul, I often think about that family, where they are now, how is their child, and really the gift that they gave me, really, the gift of their presence at that critical moment. And she and her husband left a really lasting impression at that moment. And again, it just gave me that extra sense of courage and of momentum that I was on a journey, and there was no going back from this. That I was getting ever closer to Islam.
The extraordinary journey of the heart, but there's also another more intellectual side, where, because you as a Christian would have believed, I assume, in the Trinity and the incarnation and the atonement and so on. But Tawheed, one of the key words, is very different, and a very simple concept of the unity and the oneness of God. So how did you move in that direction towards these different concepts?
Yes. So I think that, there I was, Paul, holed away in East Kent before I moved back to London. I began my reading, and so I came across this belief in Tawheed. And as I began to explore this Islamic belief, which is at the heart of Islam, it made me then, of course, explore who Jesus who Jesus was for me and has been up to that point. And I think Christians do believe that they have a very dynamic, living relationship with Jesus, and I certainly did. Jesus was at the very heart of who I was as a Christian. But as I began to explore Tawheed, the absolute oneness of God, of Allah, something very interesting happened, because I began to then, of course, explore this idea of Jesus as the Son of God. And what did that mean in the New Testament? What did it mean in the Old Testament? And I began to then, in a sense, go back. I went back and began to explore the beginnings of the early church, the various Jewish and Christian sects that were operating at that time, who had varying beliefs, varying narratives of who Jesus was. And so I began to discover the Nazarenes and their belief that Jesus was indeed a prophet. I began to explore the powerful dominance of St. Paul in the early church. And I just want to talk just for a minute about Paul, because Paul as we know, had a religious experience on the road to Damascus, and it changed his life completely. But of course, Paul was somebody who had never met Jesus. And I think it was Paul who began to, I think, widen Jesus's ministry and mission to the Gentiles, to the non-Jews, by redefining what Son of God meant. If you look at Hebrew scripture, if you look at the Jewish tradition, I think I'm right in saying that the Son of God originally was anybody who was a man of piety, a man of great knowledge, a man of great respect and holiness. And so you could define Jesus in that respect, a man of incredible piety and knowledge, somebody very special, but not literally the Son of God. I think Paul wanted and wished to widen the mission to the Gentiles, and I think obviously they may have struggled with this Jewish concept. And so I would argue that Paul had a significant part to play in the direction of the early church, in the understanding of Jesus as literally the Son of God. And also, as I was reading and learning, of course, I revisited the Gospels and the authenticity of the Gospels, the authenticity of Jesus' words. And again, you can argue that the Gospels were not, in fact, eyewitness accounts. They were written much later. And so I began again to question this word authenticity of those early texts. And so this, during those days of reading in Kent as a hospice chaplain, there was this change going on intellectually and of course from the heart. The heart and the mind were coming together to go through this change. And I also began to question the idea of priesthood itself. Right. I find within the Catholic tradition and the Orthodox tradition, and in many ways the Church of England, that the idea of priesthood, it's a very clerical structure. It's very hierarchical, with archbishops and bishops and priests. And I began really just to question this separateness, this otherness of the priest and the laity, and how the priest is very much placed on the pedestal. And when I began to really get close to Islam, what I found was an incredibly egalitarian religion where respect is earned through knowledge and through another word of mine, taqwa. And anyone within Islam can lead the salah, the communal prayer.
Yeah.
There's no strange ceremony that you have to go through in order to lead the prayers. We are one, standing shoulder to shoulder. I can be next to a professor on one side. I can be next to a road sweeper on my other side, and we are one. And that really struck me as well when I was on the cusp of saying my Shahada. And perhaps I'd like to share my story of where I said my Shahada.
Please do. Yes, go ahead.
So at this point, I knew that I was on the very cusp of converting. So I made the decision to go and go on holiday to a Muslim country. So the country closest to England and the cheapest to travel to was Morocco. So I went to Morocco, and I went to the ancient city of Fez. And it was the most extraordinary 2 weeks of my life.
Wow.
I arrived in Marrakesh. I spent a day and night in Marrakesh, and then I traveled by train. It took about 6 or 7 hours by train all the way to Fez. And I arrived, and I went into the ancient Medina, an incredible place of barakah, of blessing. And I think it was the second or third day, I then decided to walk into a mosque, an old mosque in the Medina. And I went up to this young man and I said in English that I would like to become a Muslim. And he could only speak French or Arabic. So he called his friend over, Taha, still a lifelong friend of mine. And he sat me down. And there was about 8 or 9 Muslims around me on the floor in a circle. And he asked me some questions. And I said, yes, I'm ready to say the Shahada. So I recited the Shahada in English and then in Arabic. He then taught me how to perform wudu. I then joined them for the Dhuhr prayer. I then decided to change my name. You don't have to change your name. I decided to change my name to Yusuf. I went back to England and had to face the music.
Well, that's my next question. I mean, what did you tell your bishop?
Well, you know, I was still a priest at this point.
Yeah.
So actually, I didn't. I decided. Not really, maybe, I don't know if it was cowardice or being wise, but I actually decided to keep that private. So here and now, Paul, 13 years later, I am going public. And this is the moment where some people, if they come across your channel, will say, wow, so this is where he went.
Thank you very much, Yusuf, for your time. And
thank you so much.
And thank you. Until next time.
Yes, inshallah. Ma salama. Ma salama. Thank you.